Hello and welcome, everyone. My name's Gavin Woodhall, and I'm Professor of Neuropharmacology at Aston University and one of the co-directors of the Institute of Health and Neurodevelopment. It's my great pleasure today to welcome you to the second in our series of public lectures on the theme of molecules to mind. And in this session, we're going to hear from Professor Jackie Blissett and her colleagues, Doctors Abigail, Pickard and Megan Jarman. Jackie is Professor of Childhood Eating Behaviour at Aston University, and she's a co-director of the Institute as well. And she's the leader of a group of scientists who are working on eating behaviour in children and adults. Jackie's work focuses on why children eat what they eat, how this relates to their parents and other influences, and how we can better understand the interaction between food, emotions, health, and things like obesity. Jackie's going to talk today about why children eat what they eat, and why a one-size-fits-all approach to changing eating behaviour in children may not be the best when it comes to developing healthier eating habits. Also speaking today will be Dr. Megan Jarman, and she's an independent research fellow at Aston. And Megan's work investigates how patterns of eating behaviour are instilled in early childhood. And her work encompasses nutrition, epidemiology, and health psychology. And we'll also hear from Dr. Abigail Pickard, and she's a research fellow working with Jackie on the Appetite project, which is one of the larger research projects that Jackie leads. We will be taking questions at the end of this lecture, so if you have any, please feel free to post them in the comments section. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Professor Jackie Blissett.
Thanks very much, Gav. Thanks for the introduction. I need to go back a few slides. Becky, if you can post the slides from the start. Apologies for the delay. You're seeing everything, they're revealing all the surprises backwards there. Thanks very much. Okay, so it's my great pleasure to talk to you all today about understanding and supporting children's healthy eating behaviour. So as Gav said, I'm joined by my very talented early career researchers who are part of the Psychology of Eating in Adults and Children research group here at Aston University, and we're part of the School of Psychology and the Institute of Health and Neurodevelopment. And I'd like to start by giving you an idea of why we're interested in children's healthy eating and how to make a positive change in that behaviour in that area. If you Google children's healthy eating, perhaps you're a parent, for example, of a child whose diet you are slightly concerned about, or you've got some feeding problems. You Google children's healthy eating and you're looking for advice. What you'll get is lots and lots of really great evidence-based advice on what children should eat. So on the left-hand side of this slide here, you can see resources from the British Dietetic Association, the British Nutrition Foundation, the NHS, and a variety of sources of legitimate support for what should be eaten. Most of these focus on things like increasing the amount of fibre your children eat, or increasing the number of fruits and vegetables that they accept. But what's really lacking is how we help children to eat healthily. Most parents are well aware of what should be eaten, but not how to actually get their kids to do it. And the challenge of this area is that one set of advice simply does not fit all children. Every child is different, their feeding problems and eating behaviours are different. And so we need to develop better strategies to understand those behaviours and to support and change children's eating behaviour for the better. So that's what we do in our research group. Megan Jarman's, I'm going to give you an overview of what we know already from research about children's eating behaviour. Megan and Abby are then going to move on to some of our more detailed research methodology about how we actually take this field further. So what's the problem? Why do we worry about this at all? Well, we worry about it because food-related ill health is responsible for about 10% of deaths and illnesses, and that was an estimate from 2005, and things have not got better since 2005. If anything, they've got worse. The total societal cost of obesity in the UK is predicted to be about £50 billion a year by 2050 by Public Health England. And childhood obesity has been named by the WHO as one of the most serious global public health challenges of the 21st century. And here in Birmingham, things are particularly bleak. 1 in 4 children in year 6, so that's when children are just finishing primary school and entering secondary school, have obesity. So this is a significant public health challenge. Alongside that, another significant public health challenge is the consumption of fruit and vegetables. Only about 16% of 5 to 15-year-olds in England eat 5 or more portions of fruit and veg a day. And actually, adults are not much better either. Just over a quarter of us achieve that target. And this is despite the fact that the majority of people are aware that we should be eating those 5 portions. So it's not a question of lack of knowledge. It's a question of translating that knowledge into action, into practice. How do we actually change that behavior? So let's go back to the basics. Why do we eat what we eat as humans? And at the fundamental level, this is about hunger and appetite. And there are 2 primary kinds of appetite that we think about as psychologists and biologists. The first is what we call homeostatic appetite. And this is essentially hunger. It's driven by biological needs. So when our energy reserves are low, it's a very complex system within our bodies and our brains that communicates the need for eating, and we are driven to seek out sources of food that are going to give us that energy. There is, however, a significant component that motivates our eating behavior that's called hedonic appetite. This is essentially what we might colloquially think of as our pudding stomach. So the wanting and liking of food, there's always room, isn't there, for that delicious chocolate mousse dessert, even after a giant Sunday roast dinner, for example. So this food reward that we experience, the pleasure from eating, is also really motivating, and it tends to be focused, of course, on those highly palatable foods. So when we're looking at the choice between a donut and some broccoli, actually the donut wins every time in terms of homeostatic appetite, but also hedonic appetite. It's a great source of energy, and it's a really rewarding food to eat. It's only really as we get older that we start to think about perhaps the benefits of eating broccoli. Perhaps it's going to help reduce our risk of cardiovascular disease. Let me tell you now, the average 2 to 3-year-old is not in the slightest bit interested in reducing their risk of cardiovascular disease. They're much more motivated by that donut than they ever will be by the broccoli. The other important thing to know about these types of appetite is that people vary in both types of appetite. So not choosing the donut is much, much harder for some people than it is for others. People vary in how sensitive they are to their internal signals of hunger, but also in the rewarding nature of food. For some people, food is such a rewarding and enjoyable experience. It makes healthy food decisions much more difficult. And that is also true for children. So when we're thinking about how children vary in terms of their eating behavior, we can think about their variation across these 2 dimensions of appetite, but also food acceptance. And it's the children in the top right quadrant and in the bottom left quadrant that we have most concerns about in terms of the requirement for intervention. So if we're thinking about children who have very large appetite, who also have very wide food acceptance, these are children who tend to be higher in risk for obesity. They tend to also have a fairly wide dietary range, and we, as in psychology terminology, we call this being high in what we call food approach behaviors. These children really enjoy their food. They tend to be very food responsive, and that means they're paying attention to the food cues in their environments. The sight or the smell of food makes them driven to consume it, and that leaves them at risk of obesity. At the other end of the potential problem scale, we have the children who are perhaps very small appetites, and they also have a very narrow range of food acceptance. These are the children who are at greater risk of being underweight or having a poor quality diet. And these children are high on what we call food avoidance traits. And this includes, of course, fussiness or selective eating, not wanting to eat a very wide range of foods. But these children are also quite sensitive to their internal signals of satiety. So they get full very quickly. So when they eat a small meal, they will become full very quickly, and they won't be very motivated to eat much more than that. So all children are different. All children will fall somewhere on these on these spectrums. So our advice needs to be tailored for their specific traits and the specific problems that they are experiencing. When we think about all of the complexity of what predicts where children are on those two dimensions, we start to realize why it's so difficult to change behavior. Eating behavior is complicated, particularly when we're thinking about children. And this model here is the model that we use to guide a lot of our research. So, for example, at the center here, we have genetic differences that are specific to eating. And these include those related to appetite, but also our sensory processes, for example, the degree of taste sensitivity, which vary between individuals on a genetic basis. And also, for example, behaviors such as neophobia. Neophobia essentially means fear of new foods. So our reticence to try new foods varies between individuals. And I'll come back to all of these factors in a little more detail in a second. So these are the specific differences that are really central to determining whether children have a healthy appetite or a low appetite, or they're very food selective, or they eat a wide variety of foods. Outside of that, there are also other children's characteristics, including what we call temperament. So again, I'll go into more detail about how temperament might actually also affect eating behavior as well as other behaviors in children. And of course, children don't just live in a vacuum. They tend to live in a family. And so parents have a profound influence on their children's eating, including through their feeding practices. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And finally, of course, those families are not just living alone. They are living in a much broader ecological or social and economic environment. And this has a significant effect on things like the types of food that are available, the amount of food that's available. Parents living in poverty will often experience food insecurity. The culture in which we live will determine what foods are acceptable and what's available, and when they're introduced and how foods are used. So there's a whole host of other broad factors that might influence children's acceptance and exposure to foods. And of course, for children, it's also important to note that we have significant development across time. We can't compare the eating behavior of a 6-month-old to the eating behavior of an 18-month-old, a preschooler, middle childhood and adolescent. They're all very, very different. We need different models for each age range. So let's start at the very center of that model with genetics. And I want to talk to you about behavior genetics of appetite and selective eating. It's widely established now that around 50% of our weight variation is explained by our genetics. So although many people might take pride in the fact that they've maintained a healthy weight, actually those people have had the advantage probably of having the kinds of genetic traits that have predisposed them to be a more healthy weight. We see significant heritability. That's essentially the degree to which genes are important in determining later behavior of both these food avoidant and food approach behaviors. And we can see these through the use of twin studies, where we can look at the differences and similarities between identical and non-identical twins. So the degree to which your child is food fussy or is very sensitive to their internal signals of fullness is likely to be strongly related to their genetic traits. The degree to which they are food responsive or they enjoy food is also related, although to a slightly less degree, to their genetic traits. The environment is still important, but genes are really key to help us understand what's going on for these children. And it means essentially that from infancy, some individuals are much more genetically vulnerable to gaining excess weight in our constantly abundant food environment. Another source of individual variation in eating behavior that has a genetic component is neophobia. And neophobia, as I've already said, is essentially fear of trying new foods. And we can see a significant change in neophobia across time. If you look at the average infant, sort of 6 to 9 months old, if you give them something they've never seen before, they will often put it in their mouth, whether that's a berry or it might be a scorpion on a stick. They will explore it typically with very little reticence. Once a child reaches around about 2 years old, though, there seems to be something that happens to them that makes them suddenly quite reluctant to consume foods they've not had before. And we think that this has an evolutionary advantage. This is the time at which infants are often mobile. They're often slightly less under the supervision of their caregivers constantly. So we think it has evolved to protect those infants from consuming foods that they've not been introduced to by parents at that time. That increase in neophobia tends to stay fairly high until around the sort of 6 to 7 year old mark, where it starts to gradually decrease. It's important to note that it's not just a developmental stage, though. There are some children who are fundamentally more fussy, more neophobic than other children, and that neophobia will often stay as a fairly stable trait into adulthood. It does get better, but those extremely neophobic infants often end up being fairly neophobic adults also. We think this is partly to do with sensory processing. So our senses affect our eating behaviour in every way that you could imagine. And people vary enormously in the degree of sensitivity that they have across all of their senses. And this, of course, is true for children also. There will be some children, maybe there are some people in the audience who have children who are like this, who will notice extremely small changes in, for example, a blemish or a colour of a food that mean that they reject them. Other children don't notice these changes at all. Some children go as far as rejecting foods based on changes in packaging, for example. The degree of tactile sensitivity that a child has will make a difference to how willing they are to touch and try foods. But of course, the most important senses in this area are taste and smell, which together create flavour. And we've shown in the past that children who are more taste and smell sensitive eat less fruit and vegetables, irrespective of their parents' diet. So even when they have parents who eat a very wide range of fruit and veg, it's abundant in the household, those children with those greater sensitivities find it much harder to accept fruits and vegetables. And so for those children, the interventions need to be different and tailored to their specific sensory challenges. So back to our model then, we've talked about these genetic differences at the centre. Let's talk briefly about temperament. It's fundamentally the case, no parents would widely acknowledge this, but it's fundamentally the case that some kids are just more difficult than others to parent. And this is based on what we call temperament. Temperament is a biologically based set of behaviours that are evident from birth. So some infants show greater negative affect than others. They're more negatively emotional. Some infants are fundamentally more sociable and outgoing than others. And some infants are really good at regulating themselves. They tend to be able to calm themselves quickly. And these characteristics are also linked, not surprisingly, with eating behaviour. So the infants who are much more difficult and emotional also tend to have more negative meal times and greater food refusal. Children with those more emotional temperaments are also more likely to display these food avoidant behaviours into childhood, including neophobia. And the thing is that it's not just that children with those temperaments have those greater risk of feeding problems, but temperament also elicits feeding practices. So, for example, we've shown that parents will introduce solid food earlier to babies if they perceive them to be more sociable, and parents use more forceful feeding practices when their children are difficult. So temperament has that effect on eating behaviour. Why does it matter to us as psychologists? Well, it matters because it affects the effectiveness of interventions. Claire Farrow, one of our other Peach research group members, led this study by Claire Holly and along with Emma Haycraft, which was a fantastic study looking at the effectiveness of the parent-led home-based vegetable interventions. So parents had to repeatedly expose their kids to these vegetables to see if they improved acceptance. And intervention was indeed extremely successful. It resulted in 8 times the consumption of the amount of disliked vegetables compared to the children's intake at baseline. But they noticed that some children really improved in this intervention and some didn't, and they looked to see what would predict essentially the success of the intervention. And it turned out that the success of the intervention was predicted by the child's sociability and their food fussiness. So the more sociable children who started with less food fussiness had a great response to this intervention. But the less sociable children who were more fussy to start with, in other words, the children that we really need to intervene with, did not show an important response to this intervention. So that again illustrates why we need to be tailoring our interventions. Finally, for my section, I'd just like to talk about parents' feeding practices. So we haven't got enough time to go into this in any depth in this lecture, but parents influence their children's eating in many ways. So we have this core of the child's genetic predisposition and the environment provided by the parent. And that environment is provided right from the word go. So the uterine environment is an important predictor of children's flavour exposure, for example. We've recently demonstrated that fetuses are exposed to flavours in the uterine environment, and that this may predispose acceptance of those familiar flavours later. Breastfeeding has a similar effect in that breastfed babies, particularly if they're breastfed for a considerable period of time, will experience much greater variation in the flavour of the milk that they consume, but the flavours coming from mother's diet. So if the mothers have a really wide variety of food intake, the infants get that exposure through breastfeeding. Then comes the introduction to solid food, and when parents do this and with what they do it also really matters. So weaning your infant with a wide range of, for example, vegetables and fruit seems to be a really positive way of facilitating acceptance of those foods later. Parents also, of course, play an enormous role in providing the appropriate foods within the home and also consuming them themselves. So infants and children are much more likely to consume foods if they see other people consuming them too, and particularly if they see other people enjoying them. And then finally, it's not just what parents are providing and feeding their kids, it's also how they are doing it. So parent feeding practices are really, really important. And I just want to take a minute to talk about a few different feeding practices that are commonly used. And there are pros and cons of each type of feeding practice. So restrictive feeding practices are not surprisingly used more frequently by parents who are concerned about their children overeating. And of course, it involves prevention of access to or limiting the amount of a food consumed. The problem with overt restriction, so restriction that the child is aware of, is that it tends to actually focus the child's attention on the restricted food and makes that food much more attractive and has been prospectively associated with greater BMI in the longer term. When we use what we call covert restriction, and that could include, for example, not buying the foods, not bringing foods into the house that you don't want your children to consume, that seems to have a much more productive effect. Pressure to eat is another commonly used feeding practice, used often by parents who are concerned that their children are not eating enough or not eating the right foods. So parents might pressure the consumption, for example, of vegetables. And unfortunately, pressure to eat actually also has the capacity to backfire. Studies have shown that when a child is pressured to eat a specific food, they tend to then like that food less, and they will be less likely to choose it again in the future. So whilst it's important that we offer regularly the opportunity to try new foods, it's very important that we don't pressure our children to consume them. Reward is also a regularly used feeding practice, and parents might use rewards for consuming all of the food on a plate. And a very common story that we hear is parents saying, well, if you eat your broccoli, you can have your ice cream. Or if you eat everything on your plate, you can have a dessert. And unfortunately, all that does is essentially takes children's attention away from their internal signals and focuses them on the need to consume everything on the plate. It increases the desire for the reward food, which is typically, let's face it, the sweet and fatty stuff, and it decreases their interest and motivation to consume the stuff they're being rewarded for eating. On the other hand, you can use rewards like stickers or praise when a child, for example, tries something new. So if you offer the child a bit of red pepper, they've never had red pepper before, and they get a sticker if they just try it, that actually seems to be a very functional strategy. And a couple of other feeding practices that we know to be really positive if used well are exposure and modelling. And exposure is really, really important. Familiarity is so key to children's diets. They tend to eat what they know, and so providing access to and facilitating availability of new foods, particularly early in life, is a really positive way of expanding children's diets. And modelling, as I've already mentioned, it's a really powerful way of showing children that foods are enjoyable and that they are regularly part of an adult diet. That seems to be really beneficial. So what can we do to maximise children's healthy eating? These are our top 10, the Peach top 10 evidence-based recommendations. That would be to encourage early exposure to a wide variety of flavours from breastfeeding onwards, to offer a wide range of family foods, but never to force or pressure a child to eat together in family mealtimes whenever possible to make the most of those modelling experiences, to consider children's sensory issues. So, for example, if they're particularly smell sensitive, would they benefit from trying new foods, perhaps in a not in the kitchen where there's lots of cooking smells, but perhaps elsewhere in the house. Try to reduce mealtime tension and stress, and this often comes from the parent wanting to do the best for their child, but try to play this as a long game, take a deep breath, think of it as lots of individual opportunities to expand children's diet, not as each mealtime being a critical mission in and of itself. If you want a child to eat something, eat it yourself. Reward trying new foods with things like stickers. Don't use food to regulate emotions or use foods as rewards. And don't buy foods that you don't want your children to eat. And finally, if you can afford it, make healthy food available and accessible in the home. So these are our top 10, and different strategies might work for different children. And these strategies will probably be effective for many children to ensure a good enough diet. No diet is ever going to be perfect, and a healthy enough weight. But for some children, these strategies won't work, and they don't work well at all for some kids. So we have not been particularly effective at intervening to improve children's diets or to reduce childhood obesity in those kids that really need it most. And to do this, we really need to embrace the complexity of children's eating behaviour and integrate these differences that I've been talking about into our interventions to maximise effectiveness. So we need to know what works for who. So Megan, I'm going to hand over to Megan now, who's going to tell us more about what works for who and in what circumstances. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks, Jackie. So the bottom line is it's complicated. So us as scientists, when it comes to evaluating influences on children's dietary intakes, we tend to try and fit our influences into quite neat statistical models. We know, as Jackie mentioned, that there are many influences on children's diet quality, but the way in which we analyse them tends to be in rather static statistical models, and we assume that the relationships between the causes and the effect on the outcome are somewhat linear. And although we do try and account in our statistical models for the relative effect of many causes on children or influences on children's eating dietary intakes, what we do in order to account for lots of different influences is we essentially hold them still in our numerical models to isolate the effect of one, and then one or two, and then that's what we intervene on. But similarly, even in our more sophisticated statistical models and numerical models, when it comes to trying to quantify these relationships, we tend to assume things are relatively stable, traits are relatively stable, and that their effects on the outcome are linear. I'm sure many of you who have fed young children, I have a 2-year-old myself, can attest to the fact that many of the influences on their quality of diet, including themselves at meal times, are not still. They don't stand still, they are moving. So this is a better pictorial representation of the influences on dietary intakes. This, in fact, is a diagram of the relationships between influences on developing obesity, but eating behavior is part of that. So one of the things I think that we could be better at as scientists is to account for the fact that many relationships on healthy eating behaviors, the influences might be interrelated, but if you manage to change the outcome in children's dietary intake, so yes, this child has eaten this vegetable, that may elicit a change, loop back to changing some of the influences. So you can imagine this is made up of lots of interrelated and ever-changing entities. And in that way, we can think of the influences on children's dietary intakes as a system. We need to think and evaluate factors as part of a system. Again, the diagram you can see is a lovely representation of systems thinking, and many scientists over the last sort of 20 years have started to appreciate the fact that influences on health behavior are complex, and we need to account for complexity in our thinking and in our design of interventions. And then we go back and evaluate the numbers related to that, and we fit them into very linear static models. So we're not really evaluating these influences as a system. They're not individual elements, they are elements that work together, or the sum is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts is often bandied about. So luckily, we don't need to reinvent the wheel to try and do this. There are systems modeling techniques that are available for us. Typically, they were established in the engineering sciences. So when you're actually trying to simulate a system like an engine or a machine, and they have been evolved to be able to simulate populations and social interactions. And one such modelling technique is agent-based modelling. So what is agent-based modelling? It is a computational method or a simulation, essentially. It simulates individuals and their behaviour. So in our case, that would be children and whether or not they are likely or not likely to eat vegetables. It simulates their behaviour over time based on their own characteristics. So whether or not they tend to be more or less fussy or have higher levels of neophobia. We can take into consideration some of the temperament issues that Jackie was talking about. And it simulates their behaviour, so their willingness to eat vegetables based on their own characteristics, their social environment, so that interaction with their parents' characteristics, their parents' actions, and their physical environment, so the physical space in which they are located when they are eating. And crucially, in agent-based modelling, these entities change and move over time. So changes in social environments can change the behaviour of the individual. The behaviour of the individual can also change their social environment and their physical environment and what have you. So in that way, it is perhaps a slightly better mirror of reality and the complexity of feeding children than our very static linear models have represented in the past. So my study, the ambient study, is the agent-based modelling of behaviours in early nutrition. And we are using agent-based modelling to evaluate meal times as a complex adaptive system and its system influences on children's vegetable acceptance. So in young children between the ages of 1.5 to 4 years, mostly their interactions with vegetables come at family or at meal times. And so that's why we're focusing on there. It's I can't do it all myself. I'd love to be able to say that I can sit and program models. I'm not a modeler. So we are combining the disciplines of psychology, of public health nutrition, and computer science. And we've got a fantastic collaborator, Dr. Maria Klee, over in computer science, who is working with us on this. And then because it's absolutely imperative to us that our work is always translational and applied in its nature, and we're not just sat in our, in our offices twiddling with numbers, we have got collaboration with Walsall Council Public Health team. And the first step really was to determine which elements were most important in the system of a mealtime that we want to model, that we want to simulate. And we took a co-creation approach to determining what those elements were. We had some great workshops with stakeholders from numerous services and parents that work with young children to build up a systems map of influences that we could include in our system. And we also recently published a systematic scoping review of influences on dietary intakes of preschool children, which was a review of 246 academic articles to get an idea, sort of a wide lens view of the academic evidence. So we were fairly certain that we knew what it was in the system that we wanted to model. But then we need to start thinking about the dynamic processes between the elements in the model. And the evidence just isn't there yet. So we needed to ask the question, well, how do parents and children behave during mealtimes? How do they interrelate? And our traditional ways of collecting data using surveys and questionnaires and focus groups and interviews are fantastic, but they can't really get at this transiency of elements during a short period of time. One option would have been to perhaps ask families if they would have a video camera set up and we could observe meal times, but as you can understand, that comes with ethical and resource implications. So fantastically, our collaborators in computer science said, well, we can create what is known as a participatory simulation, or to you and I, a computer game. So we have spent the last year or so developing a computer game called FeedQuest to collect our data on these dynamic processes involved during the meal times. So FeedQuest is a simulation. Parents are the players of the computer game, and the child and the environment are simulated. Because we really want to get at this, what works for whom and under what circumstances, it's important that the child's characteristics can be tailored to the child that the parent has in mind when they're playing the game. So as part of the character build, the parents are asked to complete a couple of questionnaires to assign their child character to play within the game to a certain level of food fussiness and emotionality, which should reflect that of their child. They can also change their aesthetics to make it look a little bit more like they're playing the game with their own child at home. They're then placed into a simulated home environment. And the idea of FeedQuest is to feed your child during a mealtime that reflects the sorts of mealtimes you might have at home. So parents can build a plate. There's always a broccoli, which happens to be the target vegetable in this game, in this scenario, on the plate, but they can build up other things that they might put on it. And then the parent player can carry out certain actions. They can talk to the child, and each of the statements that the parent can choose from in the game reflects a feeding practice that Jackie was talking about earlier. And they could possibly sit and eat the same meal as the child. There's a treat cupboard if that's something that they might use it at home, and they can set up and interact with the mealtime environments, and they can change depending on the course of the meal times so they're asked to play as they would do a meal time at home. Once they click on the button attempt to feed child, we see what the child's response would be. Now the child has 4 possible responses. They eat easily, they're quite happy to eat up their broccoli, no problem. They eat reluctantly, so they sort of put it to their lips, not really very happy about this, leave it there. They can quietly refuse it, so just sort of push the plate away, but not attempt to try the vegetable. Or they can have emotional refusal, which is a full-blown tantrum. So the likelihood of each of these responses is what we've programmed into the game based on the evidence and the stakeholder workshop that we carried out before. And every time the parent player takes an action in the game, it adjusts the likelihood of the child's response. Crucially, once this child has responded, we can see what the parent would do next. And that's where we get this rich dynamic data. So if a child quietly refuses, do parents tend to change up their feeding strategies? Do they say something to the child? Do they change up the environment? And in this way, we'll start to get at what are those dynamic processes and interactions between children, parents, and environments during meal times. So that's where we're at the moment. We took the first version of FeedQuest to the Think Tank Science Museum in Birmingham during Science Week and had parents come and help us with our alpha testing. That I identified a few bugs that we're currently fixing, and we're looking to run the next user testing, much more in-depth user testing of FeedQuest with parents here at Aston in the next couple of months. We will then release FeedQuest open source, so people can use it, people can play it. If they play it, we would like them to be able to collect the data on how they're playing it and what the responses of the child is and what have you. And we will use that data to inform our complex system model of meal times. Once we've got our complex systems model, our agent-based model of meal times, we can then alter elements in that system, in that simulation, that might reflect proposed interventions. And that will help us start to address what might work for whom. So given a child's level of food fussiness and emotionality, what are the sort of strategies parents use after children have perhaps emotionally refused the food? What does changing something in the environment or the parent's feeding strategy do to the child outcome, and which one seems to be most successful? And just as a side, we are very aware that this FeedQuest offers more than just a virtual laboratory. So we love it because it offers a really great way for us to collect new, exciting, dynamic data on these sorts of processes. But actually, when we were at Think Tank, as more I speak to parents, the more I hear that perhaps having a tool such as a computer game to play to test out different strategies of feeding children, especially those on the slightly fussier end, might be a really useful tool for them to have, so that they can test out strategies in quite a safe virtual environment before they put the time and the effort that's required to embed them in their life at home. So that's complex systems from our and how we're using that to address differences in children's vegetable intakes. And I will now pass over to Dr. Pickard, who will talk to us about tailored interventions.
Thank you, Megan. So both Megan and Jackie have very nicely outlined the complexity of children's eating behaviour, but I'm now going to take the opportunity to briefly explain a relatively new project that we've started in the Peach Group entitled Appetite in Preschoolers, Producing Evidence for Tailoring Interventions Effectively. So, as Jackie nicely mentioned, there are different types of eating behaviours in young children. And so on one end of the spectrum, we have these children that have heavily restrictive diets and commonly show food refusal at meal times. On the other end of the spectrum, we have these children that have got a very high food approach. And what the issue is at the moment is we do not know the best advices regarding the feeding practices for parents who have young children with avid appetites. And what I mean when I say avid appetites is these children who fall onto the scale of having wide food acceptance and a large appetite. And as outlined by Jackie, this is problematic because it commonly leads to an increased risk of obesity and overweight. So saying that, the aims of this research that we intend to run over the next 3 years is to examine how parents interact with their preschool children with avid appetites regarding food and food context, to also examine how these interactions might predict short and long-term effect on the child's eating behaviour, and then with the overall aim of developing recommendations for intervention. So in order to achieve our aims, we will follow this behaviour change framework in order to understand the behaviour, identify intervention options, and identify the content and implementation that will have the most success. So if we start off at stage 1 in understanding the behaviour, we need to define the problem behaviour at hand. So in this project, this would be the overeating in children. And then we also need to identify the specific target behaviour. And as Jackie already mentioned, there are many different factors that influence children's eating behaviour, from socio-environmental aspects to personal eating practices, the parents' eating practices, the child's temperament, and also genetics. This led us to design the very first work package to try and understand the relationships between children's food approach and parents' feeding practice. And more specifically, to answer the research question, to what extent do parental feeding practices affect the development of children's food approach? And in order to answer this first question, we will gather data from children regarding their feeding behaviour and also their parental feeding practices at both 16 months of age and 5 years of age to determine what direction and relationships are at hand. We also want to answer the question, to what extent can genetic factors influence children's food approach, explaining parental feeding practices, and how does this change across time? And in order to do so, we have a sample that we will use for this study of over 2,000 sets of twins, both identical and non-identical, and this will help us disentangle the genetic influence from the environmental influence. Concomitantly, as work package 1, we also intend to run work package 2 to try and understand the views and perspectives of parents with children with high food approach. So as you can imagine, parenting a child with high food approach is often quite tricky at times, with children becoming very emotional and often distressed at not being able to have the food that they want to have. So we are asking ourselves, how do families parent their children with high food approach within a food context? And then also, what are the emotional, contextual, and child food approach behavioural predictors of parental feeding practices in real time and real life contexts? And this takes a 3-step approach. So in the very first step, we release a questionnaire to 2,000 families with a child between 3 and 5 years old. And that is to identify which children have the high food approach. So once we've identified the children that are showing a high food approach or these avid appetites, we will then invite the parents to an interview to gather their experiences and their perspectives on the challenges that they face parenting their child with high food approach. Then we'll combine this with the final step, in which we will gather real-time data, in which parents will complete a smartphone-based application, which will ask them to complete surveys, which gather the emotional and contextual factors that are based around these food events with their child. So once we've gathered this information and we define the problem and the target behaviours, we then need to identify the intervention options. And we've already planned to target parental feeding practices. And the reason why we're targeting parental feeding practices is because, as outlined by both Megan and Jackie, the interventions need to be tailored, and tailoring parental practices is probably the easiest level to apply interventions at. So, for example, we can try and make ecological or societal changes, but it's very difficult. So we can try and change and modify the parent's behaviour towards the child and try and understand what are the best parental practices in reducing children's overeating. And this can be adapted in response to a child's food approach behaviour and also weight concern, and tailored to these different factors that might be involved in the child's eating behaviour. So then this will lead us on to the third work package, in which we intend to invite children and parents into the lab in order to test whether specific feeding practices can change eating behaviour in children with high food approach. So what we'll do for this is we'll invite several sets of parents with their child high in food approach, and then we'll try and adapt different parental feeding practices to determine which is the most effective in reducing overeating. So we'll display palatable foods to the child. So, for example, as you can imagine, hot dogs and cookies and crisps. And then we'll try and apply these different feeding practices and see what works the best using observational methods. So then this leads us on to the very final stage, in which we want to identify the content and implementation that works the best. And we'll take the data from the previous work packages to identify what is the most successful way to improve food approach behaviour in young children with avid appetites. And then we'll In the final work package, we'll use the knowledge that we've gathered from our previous research in order to design the content needed for an intervention and also the content delivery needed. And we'll do this in a co-creation approach, as Megan mentioned, in which we'll involve parents and stakeholders to try and gather their advice about the most effective methods to combat child overeating in young children. And with that, I just wanted to say that we are currently recruiting parents and children at the moment. So we would be happy to hear from any parents who have experience in this with this aspect, or equally, if you have any questions, please feel free to tweet us at Aston Peach or email us at appetite@aston.ac.uk. Thank you. I'll now hand it back over to Jackie.
So
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Jackie and Megan and Abigail, for that fascinating insight into all the work that you guys are doing. We're going to open up the floor to questions now. I'm just going to click on the comment section to look for those questions. So the first one there that we've got is from Danny Twist, and she's asking about the scale. Is that scale that you showed, I think on your 6th or 7th slide, Jackie, is that used for children exclusively? So I think that refers to the idea of whether you're an overeater and obese, or an overeater and a bit too thin. I think I know where I fit on the scale.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question, and actually, because these are based on genetic traits, we know that these tendencies do last into adulthood. So yes, indeed, although we've created this model as a conceptualization of the children's eating behavior that we study, you will find that you can probably find yourself on this set of continuums also. The thing I'd say, I guess, is that the environment obviously can significantly modify our food acceptance over time. Our appetite, not so much, but although of course there are changes as we grow and age. But yeah, typically speaking, the level of food acceptance that you have and the degree of your appetite will be relatively stable. So yes, you could easily apply this model to adults also.
Okay, so another question we've got here is from Claire Farrow, and she's asking, do child eating behaviours tend to cluster together? So how does that work, Jackie?
Yeah, so again, yes, they do. They do tend to cluster, and typically we see children who are relatively high in food approach or food avoidance. So typically speaking, you might see a child who's relatively fussy and also high in satiety responsiveness, or a child who's high in enjoyment of food and food responsiveness. And I think Claire's point is that, you know, it would be ideal to have a child who's low in fussiness and high in satiety responsiveness. And I guess, you know, that's what we'd all hope, wouldn't we? We'd all like to be in that category. And I suppose our job as psychologists is to create the best environment to actually ensure we get the kids who can be in that category as close to that as they can be. But yes, Claire is right, they do tend to cluster together. I don't know if there's anything that Abby or Megan would like to add to that.
No, just to add on that with this appetite study that we're currently running at the moment, so the questionnaire that we'll hand to 2,000 parents, we're hoping to gather this information as well.
Yeah, so we'll have a firmer answer on that, won't we, Abby, in a few months?
Yeah.
Okay, so we got another question here from Sophie Gifford. It says, even if I offer fruit and veg multiple times a day to my 4-year-old, they'll only eat a banana in a day, and he doesn't eat fruit and veg while he's at nursery. Should I not worry about it? As a parent, I can relate to that question.
Megan, is that one for you?
Yes, yeah, I think so. Is eating it at nursery, and often we see that there is a peer influence in young children, so they tend to do what their peers are doing, and perhaps more so than what they're doing at home. And I think, look, we'd love to have diets that are absolutely abundant in fruit and veg, but ultimately it's got to be what works for you. And I think that going from if you're someone who eats none, to go to 1, that's already a massive behaviour change. So the 5 a day philosophy has come based on evidence, but obviously to go all the way through to 5 a day for somebody who only eats 1 is a massive change. So I think repeated exposure is absolutely the key to trying to get them to eat more, and eventually probably they will. I wouldn't worry so much if it's, 1 banana a day is still 1 banana a day. So, be pleased about that. Absolutely.
Yeah. I would agree. And just to follow up with that, to say that, this is a long game. It's a long game. So your anxiety, if you can manage your anxiety about it and, celebrate that banana, allow that exposure, as Megan said, to gradually increase range and things like that of fruit and veg accepted. I think that, I think actually your 4-year-old sounds like they're doing pretty well, actually.
It doesn't go linearly either, does it, Jackie? I don't think.
No.
I mean, I know my daughter doesn't. She's gone off broccoli, having been really good. She's stopped eating it, and I'm thinking that she maybe go back to it at some point later.
She will, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, overall diet. I was just going to say, overall diet quality does seem to be fairly stable over time. So although we have moments where it drops off, and we've all done that. I mean, I went off parsnips during puberty. Who knows why? I now I'm fully back on parsnips. Love a parsnip. But so when we step back and look at overall diet quality in populations, right from early childhood over time, it tends to be a fairly stable trait. But within that will definitely be pockets of times where we don't eat things, and then we'll go back to eating them and stuff like that. So definitely a wide exposure over time, and playing the long game is the way forwards.
Okay. We got another really good question here from Danny. Do you think that the application or game that you've designed, along with the intervention plan, could be used in the same way for adults with autism or sensory issues? I think that's a really fascinating question, as we know that autistic people definitely have sensory issues, for example.
Yeah, so we have already been in talks with some paediatricians and paediatric dietitians about whether or not we could, or what processes in the game we would have to alter in order to tailor it better to suit different, perhaps, clinical populations who have on the more extreme end of selective eating. And I would say yes. Wouldn't have to just be children. It still offers a virtual space, always offers people a relatively safe space, because it's slightly abstracted from their own reality, to try out certain strategies and to perhaps show others how they wish to be fed, or so I definitely, this is something that we've already been thinking about in terms of altering it for other children in different clinical populations. But I wouldn't see why it couldn't be used to adults as well. But you just have to know exactly which elements you want to model and what the processes would be in order to program the simulation. But yes, it could be adapted.
Okay, that's an excellent answer, and so that could be of interest to a lot of people, I would imagine. So the next question we've got is wondering about whether the game can take into account differences in children throughout the day. So hunger has a big impact, doesn't it?
So watch this space would be the answer to that. It is currently a prototype, but we've just put in I am putting in for some funding to incorporate learning, so the child avatar will be able to learn throughout the mealtime and throughout the day. So if we account for time in a day, so a bit like when you're playing The Sims, you don't just play it once. You play it and your simulated family play out whole days and what have you. We would want to consider things like hunger, whether or not how many times the child has been attempted to feed that day. But we would also want them to remember from one meal time to the next what their experience of the meal time was. So if you had your child avatar had many, many tantrums, that would affect the likelihood ratios of them then attempting the food at the next mealtime, especially if it was set up in exactly the same way. So incorporating avatar learning is absolutely on the cards for our next steps with the game.
Cool. That sounds really good. Another good question here from Ellie Thomas. She says, of the Peach top 10 recommended approaches to encouraging eating, do you recommend trying them in a certain order? Or is there a hierarchy of effectiveness or somewhere that you should start on the list? That's a great question.
We've probably all got a different answer for this, so we might want to go round the table. I mean, I don't think there's really a hierarchy or a most important one. But I would say, from my perspective and my interest in my research, it's that really early stage that is really key. So if you get that right and you set up that very early uterine exposure, breastfeeding, exposure to flavors, weaning with the right kind of foods, that sets up the infant with the best chances of that early exposure learning that will help them to widen their diet as they continue along their eating trajectory. That said, of course, many parents won't have even been thinking about feeding problems when they're pregnant, and we hear from lots of parents for whom, you know, they worry a lot about the fact that they feel that they made mistakes. I mean, parents have very rarely made a mistake. It's just, you know, that's life, isn't it? But parents, for example, who perhaps felt very sick during pregnancy and didn't eat particularly well, or parents who, for whatever reason, formula fed their babies, or for whatever reason their babies were very difficult to wean, will often then ask, you know, well, what can I do now? And I guess this list, from my perspective, it's like a menu. You just pick the thing that seems most important from your perspective at the moment and try something. Yeah, but if I was to vote, I'd vote for that very early stage. I don't know, Abby, what would you pick of that of the top 10?
I think my answer is quite unsatisfactory, because it's going to be that it ultimately has to be tailored to the child and depending on what the child. So as with the interventions that are planned, it needs to be tailored to the child's problem behavior. More specifically, what kind of factors are influencing that child's eating behavior. So it would be sensory issues, for example. If it is looking like that the child has sensory issues, then it obviously is important to focus on this and to consider this when you have the eating environment. I think my number one would be to reduce the mealtime tension and stress, because in any situation, I feel like this fosters a good environment, and a happier environment is going to lead to happier behavior in the future.
Megan, I bet you've got a view on this.
I do. It's really difficult, and as we keep saying, and I know it's a bit tired, but obviously what works for some children won't work for others. The reason I'm torn is because my PhD work, a bit old now, but I'm still very proud of it, showed that parents not buying healthy foods that they didn't want to eat, so using more of this covert control, not taking their children to restaurants that sell foods you don't want to eat, so sort of managing the environment around your child was actually longitudinally associated with a better quality of diet over time. So when we measured the children when they were 3, they had a better quality of diet if their parents reported not buying the foods they didn't want to eat, and then their children had an even better, so an increase in their quality of diet when we measured them again at age 7. So I do think an element of not having the foods in the house, maybe certainly not in abundance that you don't want your child to eat, is a good strategy. But then the exposure side of things, when I turned 30, I decided to do an experiment of one, which was, can I get myself to eat the one food I really don't like, which was Marmite. And I can tell you, after about 10 exposures, especially on particularly buttery toast, I am now disappointed that I spent the first 30 years of my life not liking it, because I did manage to get myself to a point where I'm really, really enjoying it. So I've got...
It's never too late. It's never too late to learn.
So I do think little exposures over time can also be really, really key, and just making it, I know it's difficult, but as enjoyable as possible.
Great advice.
Okay, so let me just check if there are any more questions. I think that was some really good answers there. I need to learn to hate pasties. I think that's the most important thing that I can do
Look where
personally.
it works in reverse.
Yes, if it works the other way. This has been a really fascinating and insightful session, and I think it's a really important area, and loads of really excellent research going on. And I look forward to seeing how all these projects develop and our understanding grows of what makes children tick in this particular department. So I think if we don't have any other questions, no, I don't think we have. I think we can finish this lecture. So just once again, I'd like to thank Jackie and Abigail and Megan for this absolutely fascinating session today. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Gav.
you.